More than 15 years after a series of reports from the Boston Globe exposed widespread sexual abuse by Catholic priests, the Church is still reeling from accusations of misconduct and cover-ups from all over the world, with thousands of cases here in the U.S., in Germany, Australia, Mexico, Brazil, and in France, where earlier this year Pope Francis refused to accept the resignation of a cardinal who had just been convicted of covering up past sexual abuses by one of his priests. That priest, Reverend Bernard, follows three of Preynat's survivors, Alexandre, François and Emmanuel.
Je suis sûr qu'au diocèse, tout le monde savait. Pour Preynat, personne n'a rien dit. Personne n'a rien fait pendant toutes ces années.
The film is By the Grace of God, which took second place in the Grand Jury Prize of this year's Berlin Film Festival. The man behind it, celebrated filmmaker François Ozon, recently joined me. Well, it's good to meet you. Thank you so much for being here. So you followed these three survivors and their families. And from what I understand, all of the email exchanges, all of the public comments from the three men is exactly as they said them, correct?
Yes, because the first time I met Alexandre, he came with all the emails and he said to me, do what you want with that. So it was an extraordinary material for a director, for a screenwriter, because I had so many information. So I decided to tell the story with all the emails to start the film with that.
So why don't you do a documentary?
It's funny, because that was my first idea, because when I met the survivors, I thought they were very moving, they were very strong characters. And so my first idea was to make a documentary, but I realized they were very upset and sad about that, because if they trust me and told me so many secrets about their lives, it was because I was a fiction director. And you have to know, at this moment when I met them, Spotlight was just released in France, and it was a huge success. So they were waiting for me, a kind of French Spotlight. So I said, okay, I'm a director of fiction. I make a fiction with your story.
Why did you make this film? I am very familiar with your films and a fan. This is not a typical François Ozon film. Why did you make this film?
I think, you know, I've made many films about women, about strong women, and this time I want...
Catherine Deneuve, Au Pair, Rampling, everybody, yes, we know.
Yes, this time I wanted to focus on men, maybe because I'm more adult, I feel more mature to speak about men, and I was looking for a subject about that, and I found the testimonies on internet, and I was so moved, I decided to make the film.
When you were in the process of meeting and interviewing these men in anticipation of making the film, you remembered something about your own childhood that you had forgotten about.
Yes, it was disturbing, because listening to all these stories, suddenly I remember a story I had with a priest when I was very young. Nothing happened, but it could have happened. And suddenly I had a kind of vertigo, you know, feeling if something would have happened, my life would have been totally destroyed. So it was very, very strange, you know.
My understanding is, from having read interviews, you ran, is that not correct? From the priest, when he had you in a corner, is that correct?
Yes, I ran away, yes,
So did that cause you to start thinking to ask these men why they didn't do the same thing? No, but
you know, when I was a child, I didn't understand what happened. I ran away, it was maybe to survive, or I don't know, it was unconscious. I did, because very often the children don't realize what's happening, because they trust the adult, especially when it's a priest, it's someone you respect.
Of course.
So you are not afraid of him, so you believe him, you trust him, and very often you are paralyzed because you don't understand what's happening.
Someone you respect and someone your parents often respect. So Preynat, this priest...
I decided to make the film because it was so shocking when I discovered that the priest 30 years ago said already, I have problem with kids. And he wrote some letters to the parents to say, excuse me for what I've done to your son. And the cardinal and the hierarchy of the church did nothing. They just changed the place because he was a good priest.
Exactly like here, except very few of these priests admitted anything.
Yes.
So you know how big a story this was here in Catholic Boston.
Yes.
How big a story was this in Catholic France?
It was very big in Lyon. It was in the city Lyon, because Lyon is the second city in France after Paris. It's a very Catholic and conservative city, and the bishop, the Cardinal Babarin you see in the film, was the most important person of the church. You know, he could have become the Pope in France. So that's why the scandal was so big in France, and the impact of the film was very strong too.
You know, speaking of the Cardinal, for those who haven't seen the film yet, the title, The Grace of God, comes from some incredible thing
Yes.
he said at a press event, where he said, by the grace of God, most of these cases are out of date, meaning the statute
Yes.
of limitations
Yes.
was wrong. It is...
It was so shocking. It was, for the victims, it was impossible to listen something like that. And after he said, oh, excuse me for my way of speaking, but that means so many things for the people who follow the story.
You know, one of the most powerful parts of your film is we got to meet many of the incredibly courageous survivors here in Boston. We didn't meet as many members of their family. You
Yes.
take us in to their families to meet their wives, their
Yes.
lovers, these people.
That was the idea of the film. That was the idea.
And it was achieved beautifully. But one of the final scenes, even though, as we'll discuss in a second, some justice was delivered with the priest and even the cardinal, here's a final dinner in this movie. Just watch with some of the survivors and their loved one. You know, many of us who are outside of this like to think that if a priest is brought down, that justice prevails and that's the end of the story. You told very clearly for these families, even though they got some taste of justice, it wasn't over at all.
No. I realized, making the investigation, meeting all the families, that child abuse is like a ticking time bomb, you know, which damage all the family. Everybody is touched. The parents, of course, because very often they feel guilty. The children, the brother, the sister. So it was very interesting in terms of screenwriting, you know, for me as a director, to discover all that.
Before we say what happened to the priest and the cardinal here, there was litigation to try to stop this movie. Your
Yes.
laws are different from France, and we almost never got to see this thing, correct?
The lawyers of the priest tried to stop the release, but fortunately the judge decided that in the case of this film, the freedom of creation was more important than the presumption of innocence.
Which was the issue that they were raising.
Yes.
So quickly, the cardinal was defrocked.
The
the priest was defrocked,
Yes.
and he is awaiting criminal trial. Is that
Exactly,
correct?
exactly.
And the cardinal actually was convicted
Yes.
of failing to report this
Yes.
information, got a suspended sentence, which is on appeal.
Yes, and he went to the Vatican to propose his resignation to the Pope Francis, who refused it. So it was again a big scandal, because people didn't understand, because the Pope Francis always say zero tolerance for pedophilia. So the acts don't follow the words. So it's again always the same story.
Francois, last thing is Alexandre is very open with his 5 children,
Yes.
particularly his older boys, which was very powerful about what had happened to him in his life. Your film ends with his son asking him if he still believes in God. Why did you end the film that way?
I don't give the answer. It's up to you to think what you want. But yes, it was important. Actually, the real question should be, do you still believe in the institution? Because the church and the faith are 2 different things. And I think the faith of Alexander is still the same, but he doesn't trust in the institution anymore. That's sure.
Your film is brilliant and powerful, Francois. It's a pleasure
Thank you
to
very
meet you.
much.
Thank you so much for your time. You can catch By the Grace of God at the landmark Kendall Square Theatre in Cambridge and at Cape Cinema in Dennis starting this Friday, October 25th. For more information, head to musicboxfilms.com.